And gentlemen, welcome to the AIJA Webinar on Intercultural Communication for Young Lawyers. Let me remind you that all participants are on listen-only mode. At any time during the presentation, you can submit your questions in the Q&A box on the Adobe Connect presentation screen. Our speakers will answer your question during or after the presentation. I would now like to give the floor to Giuseppe Marletta, Association Manager for AIJA. Mr. Marletta, please go ahead.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to introduce this new webinar, another great initiative of AIJA, the International Association of Young Lawyers. Let me first very quickly introduce AIJA to those of you who are not familiar with our association. AIJA is the only network of international lawyers under 45. We have 4,000 members and supporters, and we are present internationally in over 90 countries. We offer online and physical opportunities to meet and network, and our core activity is the organization of events taking place all around the world. These events are designed, organized, and led by and for young lawyers. And of course, I invite you all to visit our website, www.aija.org. Why we wanted today a webinar on intercultural communication? The world today is characterized by an ever-growing number of contacts, resulting in communication between people with different linguistic and cultural backgrounds. Lack of knowledge of another culture can lead, at the best, to embarrassing or amusing mistakes in communication. At the worst, such mistakes may confuse or even offend the people we wish to communicate with, making the conclusion of business deals or international agreements difficult or impossible. Lawyers who deal with people from other cultures have to learn how to improve their performance through improving their communication skills. At AIJA, our mission is to help our members and events participants adopt a truly global perspective in order to work effectively across cultures. We assist them to acquire cross-cultural knowledge, build intercultural expertise, and develop global capabilities in order to maximize value and minimize the risks associated with being involved in international business. It is an honor for me today to give the floor now to our speaker for today, Mrs. Iris Warner. Besides giving lectures basically all around the world, Iris is Professor Emeritus for International Business at Illinois State University, where she was a professor and the director of the International Business Institute. Iris is also past president of the Association for Business Communication, and she focuses mainly on the interaction between business management, culture, and communication. She's also co-author of the very interesting book that I recommend everyone to read, Intercultural Communication in the Global Workplace. Let me remind you all that you can use the Q&A box on your screen for your questions, and Iris will take the questions either during the presentation or at the end. And then I'll give the floor to Iris. Thank you.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody to the seminar on intercultural communication. In the next hour, we will do a number of things. We will examine some cultural principles and values that shape cultures. We then will look at how those principles affect our communication, and at the very end we will look at some of the strategies to be more successful in our intercultural communication. Obviously, we will not have all the answers, but I think you will find that interesting on what we can do in order to get our communication on a better track. Before we get going, let me just give you a little bit of my own cultural background. I am both an American and a German citizen, so I have a dual nationality. I was educated in the United States and in Germany. My professional life has been completely in the United States, and personally I would say I'll probably still be pretty German. Now, my cultural profile then is I'm adapted very well to two cultures. I call myself bicultural. I'm bilingual, but yet in some ways I'm still very German. I like order and everything is 1, 2, 3. And at the same time, I'm also very American. I've become much more outgoing. And in many ways, I separate my private life and my work life. Now, why am I telling you all of this? What I would like for you to do is think for a moment about your own cultural profile. We all have a cultural profile. Yours may also be bicultural or it may be monocultural. It doesn't really matter. But the important thing is that we understand that we project our own values and our expectations on the people that we communicate with. That is called expectancy theory. I have certain expectations of how you will react to what I say or what I do. And that obviously then influences our communication. So as we look at our own cultural profile and try to establish the cultural profile of somebody else, here are some of the key elements. There is the way I see myself, and there's also how you see me. There is my expectation of you, there is your expectation of me. There is my perception of you, and there's your perception of me, and perceptions become truth because they form the foundation for our action. So this is some of the underlying groundwork as we start to look at some of the details of culture. So what is culture? What are some of the what is the nature of culture? Culture is the coherent, learned, shared view of a group of people about life's concerns that ranks what is important, furnishes attitudes about things that are appropriate, and it dictates behavior. That is a rather dense and loaded definition of culture. Here are the key elements, and that is very crucial. Culture is coherent. That means it makes sense to the people that are part of that particular culture. You know what is expected of you. You don't think about, now, why do we do this? It is an automatic thing. Culture is natural to the native. We are on autopilot. You don't wake up in the morning and as you get out of bed, you don't think, what makes me Polish, what makes me Italian, what makes me Spanish. In fact, it'd be weird if we did that. So what we have is you are on autopilot, you don't think about it, it's just the way we behave. Culture is learned. That is the second part. That means if we learn a culture, there is not a gene in our body that makes us into a certain cultural being. Now, the Japanese sometimes think that their culture is so unique, nobody could possibly learn Japanese culture. That's not true. We can learn a different culture. But that also means we can unlearn it or we can forget it. Now, the fact that we learn it is very positive because there is hope that we learn enough about each other that we can actually communicate effectively. The next part is that it is shared. It is a group thing by definition. You cannot have your own culture. You can have your own style, but you don't have your own culture. Culture, by definition, is something that we have common with a group of people. And culture ranks what is important. Some things are considered more important than other things. For example, in some cultures, time is very important. In other cultures, it is not. So it may say friendships are more important than living by the clock. So it ranks what is important, and that gives us our attitudes, and it dictates our behavior. It also gives us our reasons for the rankings. And in many cultures, that may be based on religion. So that would be something to think about. Now, as we look at culture, it is like an iceberg. In an iceberg, we see about a seventh of the iceberg that is above water, and the rest is underwater. And culture is the same thing. Much of culture is hidden that we never see. That means when we look at somebody from another culture, we only see the surface. Much of it is hidden, and we never see the whole reality. So part of intercultural communication is that we hope that we will see what is under the water, that we will explore those aspects of culture that are hidden. So how do we deal with other cultures? We bring our own culture with us. You, as lawyers, bring your legal system with you. You bring the legal structure. You will bring with you what you consider is appropriate behavior in court. Those are the starting points. And when we approach a new culture, here is what we typically do. We stereotype or we generalize. Now, you have all heard, I'm sure you have all heard, don't stereotype. Stereotyping is bad. And we would agree to that. So we generalize. That's a more neutral term, but basically it's the same thing. Now, what is stereotyping? I meet one person from China. I've never heard about China. I don't know anything about China. And I meet this one Chinese person. And whatever this person does, to me, is now what the Chinese do. In stereotyping, there is the temptation that I stick to this initial impression. But what we need to do is that I adjust my attitude or my feelings about this culture or my view of that culture as I get more information. So I meet the second Chinese who is somewhat different, and I say, maybe there are some differences. Then I meet the third and I meet the fourth. It is possible that that reinforces my initial impression, but it is also possible that I really begin to have a very different view of what the Chinese are. Now, what we typically do is when I meet somebody who behaves differently, that I describe them as they are weird, they are strange. I project my own expectations, my own views on the other side. Another way is also looking at it and saying, oh, there really are no differences. We are all human beings. So all this talk about intercultural communication is nonsense. We are all the same. Deep down, we are human beings. What I say in truth, if I have that attitude, is you are like me. So I don't really have to learn about you because we are all the same. Because we know there are some differences, and those are culture-based. So what we can say is when we meet people from another culture, we have certain records that play in our minds. And so we think, well, this is what everybody now behaves from that different culture. So let's go to the next slide here. One of our records is that Italians are very expressive. They are emotional, they are outgoing, they are loud. Where Swedes, on the other hand, are restrained, they are more quiet, they don't talk with hand and feet. And so we look at that, those are two extremes. Now, if we project these cultures in a normal curve, we will see that this is actually true when you look at the average. When you look at the average of the normal curve here, the Swedes are in fact more restrained and the Italians are more expressive. But as we look at that a little bit more closely, you will see that the tail of the curve of Swedes is actually more expressive than the average Italian. And the tail of the Italian curve, those people can be more restrained than the average of the Swedes. So what we ultimately do is we deal with individuals. You never deal with the Italians. You don't deal with the Swedes. You deal with individuals, and they may be anywhere along this curve. Now, this idea that there is a Swedish culture and Italian culture is positive insofar as it gives me a starting point. It gives me something that I can hang my initial communication on. But I have to be aware that this is not the whole reality and that I do have to adapt. So what is the nature of communication? We communicate basically in three ways. There is the verbal communication. Those are the words that we use. There is the nonverbal. That is the bowing, the gestures, the shaking of hands. And then there's the silent communication. This is how we arrange our office, for example. In the United States, when you look at an office, you know immediately is that person important or not important. Important people are on the top floor. They have a corner office. What type of furniture is in there? So we can also communicate by the way we arrange our environment. As we look at communication, here are some of the things that become important. There is the change in languages. Languages are not static. They change over time. And that is very obvious when you look at people who have lived outside their culture for a very long time. They may not have kept pace with the changes in their native language and actually may speak a somewhat outdated language. Then it also depends on, does your company have a particular language? Do you use one language? This day and age, it might very well be English. We'll come back to that. There is the whole impact of technology that influences communication. A few years ago, you would send a letter. You might go in person, and occasionally you might call, but that was expensive. Today, we can have a conference like this. We can have Skyping. We can have all sorts of video conferences. So the channel choice has been influenced by technology, which can be good or it can be not so good. It is immediate, it is instantaneous. That, of course, carries some problems. And then you have the role of the interpreter. Everybody speaks English, right? That can give you a false sense of security. Let me just give you one example here. I was negotiating an exchange program in France. And as we were talking, it was basically focused on students. And then we said, well, it might be good if we also had an exchange of administrators. So we said, all right, what we will do is we will exchange administrators. So just to make sure, we use both the English term administration and we use the French term administration. So all sides agreed to that, and then they sent a secretary. And we said, well, what are we supposed to do with the secretary? For us, administration was the dean, the department chair, sort of upper-level administrators in the university, whereas for the French counterpart, administration had a very different meaning. So we have to use words in context. Another one that for lawyers might be more important is the word force majeure. So when you look at force majeure, this is sort of things that are beyond your control, the weather, for example, an act of God, and it has a very specific meaning in the European context. In the American context, it depends on the state. There are different definitions. So you may use the word, everybody agrees on the word, and yet you come with very different aspects to that. In terms of the interpreters, you've all dealt with that. The English-speaking native, speaking with an English-speaking native, that is the easy one because we all sort of think we agree, but even here we begin to have some problems. Are we using British English? Are we using American English? Are we using English as it's spoken in India or in Nigeria, for example? And so there is a new terminology. We talk about Englishes, and it probably won't take long, where people from India may say, what do you mean I don't have correct English? This is my English. And so on the one hand, a convergence on English, and at the same time, it goes also apart again. Then you have the English native speaker speaking with somebody who has English as a second language. Now you can see the communication issues will increase. Or you have somebody from Poland negotiating with somebody from Japan, for example, and the Poles don't speak Japanese, or there are not a whole lot of Poles, and the Japanese usually do not study Polish, but they both speak English as a second language. So now you can see the communication problems are getting even worse. And then if we add an interpreter, the interpreter brings his or her own culture, and depending what language is native, what is used in the negotiation, that will have an impact as well. So this gets very complicated. Here is what we think we do. I am A, you are B, and I want to talk with you. So I think I'm communicating with you. That's the dotted line from A to B. So I encode my message. I decide based on my knowledge of you. I decide what words to use, what channel to use. Do I write to you, or do I call you? Do I visit you? What vocabulary do I use? What do I know about your professional background? And then you do the same in giving feedback. Now, when you look at this diagram, we think, if I'm A, I think I communicate with you. You think you communicate with me. But what we really do is we communicate with the perception that we have of the other person. I communicate with B1, what I think who you are. And you communicate with A1, who you think I am. So there is a gap, and this gap really can be pretty big. So in intercultural communication, the goal is that we somehow narrow the gap. The gap will never go completely away, but we hope to narrow this gap. And we hope to close that or narrow that by understanding more about the other culture. So this brings us to the front stage and backstage of culture. That's a very important aspect. It's also called the what and the why of culture. It sort of comes back to this iceberg where we say, well, the iceberg is what we don't see. The what is, as I said, front stage. This is what we can see. This is what we observe. The why of the culture, that is the reasons. So let's look at that in a little bit greater detail. The front stage culture, that's the do's and the don'ts. That's the practices. You sit there and you see what they do. The backstage culture is the underlying value. Now, let me give you a couple of examples here. When you deal with the Japanese, for example, you can get all sorts of books. I call them the how-to books, the 10 do's and don'ts of Japanese culture. And I always find it funny when I sit on an airplane, I fly to Japan, and next to me is sitting this newly minted international manager who will live in Japan for the next 2 years, and he reads this book on what to do and not to do. And I always find this funny because it's really too late and it doesn't help a whole lot. So what do we have? When we look at the Japanese, there is a protocol on how you give your business card. And the book of do's and don'ts will tell you, you must hold the business card with both hands. You bow as you give it to the other side. The person who receives the business card looks at it, makes a few comments, puts it on the desk. You never ever write on it, and you never ever put it in your pocket. And if you don't do this correctly, you will have major problems in dealing with the Japanese. Nonsense. Everybody can recover from one cultural mistake. Now, if you repeat the same mistake over and over, then you may have problems. But to do this wrong one time, no big deal. But so this is the front stage culture. I see what you do with a business card. But why is this so important? As you exchange the business card, if I know what to look for, then I will see some very important things. For example, in Japanese culture, hierarchy is very important, and what is also very important is form and rank. And that's where the business card comes in. As I look at the business card, it tells me, are you superior to me? Are you of a higher rank? Are you of a lower rank? Or how do we deal with each other? And what would be the important aspects? Other things that I can also, where very important front stage and backstage would be greeting rituals. This is front stage and backstage culture here. Greeting rituals. Do we shake hands? Do we bow? Do we kiss? Do we rub noses? Or what do we do? There is no right or wrong to this. The important thing is to understand that different cultures have different behaviors and that they are indicators of an underlying priority of what is important. So as we look at that, here is the what and the why. The what are the symbols. For example, I mentioned offices already. Big offices are symbols in the United States of importance, all right? You can also look at who are the heroes in the culture. Are those the business people? Are those poets? Are those sports figures? Are those lawyers? What are the important people who are the heroes? What rituals do cultures observe? For example, used to be in American context, if you'd been with a company for a long time, you might get a gold watch. There is the Christmas party. There is the summer picnic where you invite family. That is the what. That is what I can observe. It does not tell me the values that are underlying that. Is it that you make money? Is it that we value our employees in terms of that we really want to project the image that we are a family? That you don't observe. These are inferences that you have to make. Now, when we approach a new culture, we talk about the phenomenon of culture shock. That means that is your reaction when you first experience a new culture. There can be euphoria where you think everything is wonderful. That, of course, does not last. You then get into disillusionment. Under euphoria, everything is great. We should have done it the same way. Everybody should eat with chopsticks. Everybody should do this. Everybody should do that. And then there is the disillusionment. What was wonderful 5 minutes ago is all terrible now. And then you get to an adjustment stage. And the adjustment is you learn to live with it. And the last stage is the re-entry, when you come back home. That we call reverse culture shock. And that can actually be quite traumatic as well. Very often this is an area of culture shock that we don't deal with very much. Another way of looking at culture shock is you're in denial, where you say there is no difference, and then you resist. It cannot be done. This is stupid. It would violate the law. It's not a question, of course, whose law would it violate, but nevertheless. And then you gain some insight. You have intuitive understanding, and then you explore the new culture. You say, I wonder, maybe we could do this. Maybe we could do that. And in a diagram, we would look at it this way. You have the euphoria at the beginning. The horizontal line is your equilibrium. That's where you usually are. Disillusionment is you're really sort of almost in depression. And then you have adjustments, and that can be at several levels. You can get back to your old self. You can be suboptimal, where you sort of function in the culture, but you really never feel quite comfortable. Or you really become one of them. You go native, and that would be the extreme form. If your law firm sends you into another country, they want you to be adjusted, but they probably do not want you to become one of the other side. You're supposed to explain their culture, their legal system to the Home Office, but as soon as you become one of them, you really don't do anymore what your headquarter office needs, namely that you can also represent headquarters abroad. So it really becomes very important that you see both sides. Now, on that background, then, let's look at the context of communication. There's the high context and the low context culture, and then there is the silent language. let's look at high context and low context. In high context and low context, meaning originates differently. Nesbitt did a very interesting experiment. He had an aquarium, and he put obviously water and the fish into that, and then also plants, different colors and arrangements and little rocks and sand. And then he showed this aquarium to students who came from high cultures and who came from low context cultures. The high context cultures looked at it, and they were supposed to describe what they saw. And what they saw was the plants. They described in great detail the context in which the fish lives. The plants, the rocks, the water, all of that. And then at the end they said, oh, yes, and there is the fish. Whereas low context students did this differently. They described the fish and then said, oh, and by the way, there were some plants and there were some rocks. So they look at the same, but they come from different directions looking at the same phenomenon. In high context cultures, it is the context that counts. It's the environment that counts. And my interpretation of what you do or say comes out of this context. There's a lot of nonverbal communication involved in that. Now, from a low context culture, that means there is a lot of ambiguity, because as I start interpreting this, then of course we can have different interpretations of the same reality. In low context cultures, on the other hand, it's the words that count. Low context cultures think that the meaning originates in words. What is important is the correct word choice and clarity. We want to make things that everything is clear. As a result of that, what becomes important are rules and contracts. And as lawyers, you can relate to that. Now, a lawyer from a high context culture is still more high context than a lawyer from a low context culture. But when we look at the totality of legal language, lawyers go by what the word says. So by definition, the law itself is more low context. Now, Hall put high context and low context on a continuum. And he goes by national culture, and we can argue over that. The Japanese are most high context. The Swiss are most low context. Now, let me just preface this whole diagram by saying not one of them is correct or incorrect or right or wrong or good or bad. This is simply a reality. And you're not high context in absolute terms. It's always in relationship to somebody else. So, for example, from a Swiss viewpoint, everybody is somewhat more high context. From a Japanese viewpoint, everybody is somewhat more low context. If, on the other hand, you're French or Latin American, from a French viewpoint, Americans are low context, but Latin America, Middle East, Japanese is more high context. So it depends on where you are on the continuum. And as I said, he did this in terms of geographic areas or nations, and you can debate that. Latin America is sort of lumped all together, and we know that's not true. There are really very different Latin American cultures, and yet it's lumped together in this particular diagram. Now, on top of the national cultures that we can sort of qualify as high and low context, we have other aspects that come into that. For example, men are more low context than women. And that is true for just about all cultures. Women are more relationship building than men. There was a very interesting book by Deborah Tannum, came out about 15 years ago, Communicating from 9 to 5. And she talks about different communication styles for men and women. Men, by and large, are more direct. Women will say, well, now, if we look at this, it might be a good idea if, perhaps, etc., etc. So more roundabout, trying not to offend. Then there's also high-low context in the context of professions. For example, artists, by definition, tend to be more high context. Finance people, on the other hand, tend to be more low context. Accountants tend to be more low context. Engineers are more low context. Lawyers, as I said already, rely on the clarity and the meaning of words, so you could say, compared to artists, they are also more high context. So what we have to keep in mind, it's not just by national culture, but there are all sort of other aspects that also dictate on where this goes. Now, how does this come out in our communication? In a high context culture, you want to establish a relationship as you start your communication. I had mentioned already the importance of the business card in the Japanese context. Another way of doing that is how you start your conversation. And in Japanese context, typically, it used to be, it's somewhat changing now, but it used to be you establish this by talking about the weather. We all do this, but the Japanese had this down to a T. They might start a business letter in this cold season of winter or in this wonderful time of cherry blossoms, and you sit there and think, what the heck does the cherry blossom have to do with our negotiation? But it's their way of saying we have to create an environment, something where we can agree. And so it's the direct versus the indirect, the ambiguous versus the clear. So what they would like to do is say, well, let's take our time building the relationship. And when you go into negotiations with somebody from a high context culture, what you may very well find is that it takes a fairly long time before you sit down to do business, because they want to get a feel for you. Now, here's one of the problems. They have learned about our culture, and we learn about their culture. So in the extreme, you go into negotiations and you become more Japanese than the Japanese. They have learned about your culture, and they are more like your culture than you are. So that, of course, is then at cross purposes as well. So that is something to watch out for. But in high context culture, it's the process that counts. It is the way how you get there. Whereas in ends-oriented cultures, we look at the end. What's the goal? Here's the problem. We solve the problem. We want to solve the problem. This is the process. This is the end. At the end comes the contract. So this becomes very important. So let me just briefly recap. So far we have talked about front stage and backstage, and about high context and low context. So let's look then at this in the context of the self-reference criterion. Self-reference criterion is, I find, an extremely important concept in intercultural communication. When we are under the influence of the self-reference criterion, that means we judge anything different based on our own understanding, worldview, and value system. So when I look at somebody from another culture, I judge based on what I know, based on what I'm familiar with. And the other becomes weird and strange, all right? Now, a lot of people say we should get rid of the self-reference criterion, but that's almost impossible. The important thing is to be aware of that we have a self-reference criterion. And yes, everybody has a self-reference criterion. This is not an Italian or a British or a Norwegian phenomenon. Everybody has it. You grow up with your culture. Remember, I said culture is natural to the native, and this is exactly what we face here. So let's look at one example of the self-reference criterion, and that is the arrangement of maps. This is a map that many of you, particularly if you come from Europe, that's the world that you are familiar with. Europe is in the center. This is a two-dimensional depiction of the map. The area around the poles is pulled apart. Greenland, for example, doesn't even have a northern border. This is the map we've grown up with. If you come from this part of the world, this is what the world looks like. Of course, we know that the world is round, but this is the way we look at it. Now, this is the map I grew up with. I've been in the United States for about a year when I went back to Europe, and I bought a world map because I wanted to take this back to nieces and nephews for them to have a world map. I didn't look at the map, I just took it. All right? This was the map that I took. And the reaction was very interesting. Everybody looked at it and said, typical American. They always have to see themselves in the center. This is based on the European self-reference criterion. This was different, therefore there was a judgment. This is not just that it's different, but it shows that Americans want to always be in the center. Now let's look at that slightly differently. Let's assume you are a business, you are a law firm in San Francisco on the west coast of the United States, and you have business dealings all around the globe. This map makes a lot of sense because you can have the map in your office and you draw arrows to all the places where you have your businesses. That would make sense. Now, yet another depiction of the world would be this. This is called a Pacific-centric map. A few years ago, very popular when we talked a lot about Pacific Rim countries. All of a sudden, the Pacific is in the center. Pacific Rim countries become important. Now look what has happened to Europe. Europe is in the upper left-hand corner of the map, and just by this position is not as important as it would be in the Eurocentric map. Here's another one. This is a China-centric map. The Chinese look at themselves as the Middle Kingdom. This map shows Middle Kingdom, we are the most important. And so most cultures have the idea that they are in the center. Now look at this map. This is Australia, no longer down under. And of course the way we refer to Australia as being down under sort of writes it off. Down under is not as important. Now just think for a moment, if this were the map we had all grown up with, we would have a very different view of our own importance. Look at Europe. And you really have to almost search now, where exactly is Europe? Europe, just based on the depiction of the maps, not really that important. But Australia is like the jewel in the crown, and the rest of the world is the basin on which Australia floats. So it's a very different way. Now, geography is just one aspect of how we look at the world. Then, of course, we have cultural concepts that also influence on how we look at things. And one of those, let me just go here through a few of these concepts that become important in the legal profession as well. For example, privacy. For us, privacy is a positive term. The EU has all sorts of legislation now on the regulation of privacy, and you're familiar with the big spat with Google and the violations of privacy or perceived violations of privacy, etc. For us, privacy then has a positive connotation, and individuality is positive. On the other hand, if you go to China or to other group-oriented cultures, individuality and privacy are not necessarily seen as positive. Individuality would mean you separate yourself from the group. You want to be different. You don't want to have anything to do with the group. You basically write off the group. Therefore, if you want to be an individual, that doesn't really have a positive connotation, and the definition may be very different. For us, individuality, privacy, sort of, you do what you want to do. In China and Japan, on the other hand, individuality is defined sometimes as you do what the group wants you to do. We would say, well, but that's not individuality. So again, you have to be careful in terms of the vocabulary that is being used. Let's look at the word late. The American Indian tribe, the Navajos, they do not have a word for late. That means if they don't have a word for late, obviously time is not very important. They don't have a term for being on time either. So that is a very different communication concept. A few years ago, there was the Year of the Woman, and they had a big conference in Egypt. And a big part of the conference in the beginning was dedicated to how to translate the concept feminism into Arabic. If you don't have the concept, it is very difficult to find words that will describe something. So these are some of the concepts that we have to be aware of. So as we look at that, our environment dictates the concepts that we develop and the vocabulary that we develop. Arctic people may have a lot of words for snow because that's their environment. If you live in a desert, in the Sahara, close to it, you are not going to have a vocabulary of snow. Arab people may have many words for camel. For us, not being familiar with that, a camel is a camel is a camel. So that also has an impact what technologies we develop. In the Amazon basin, you are not going to develop heating systems, just as in the Arctic, you are not going to develop air conditioning. So our environment influences what we develop. And language then reflects what is important. In Germany, for example, knowledge you show through, or you are educated by showing your job knowledge. It's the technical expertise. It's the engineering background. This has an impact on educational systems, apprenticeships, for example. In France, on the other hand, you can impress through the way you use language. It's the elegance of the language, the precision of the grammatical usage. In China, on the other hand, it is what language you have in order to build relationships, because relationships are very important. Now, Holden, who talks about that, and he has both a language and a business background, he says that business people very often do not appreciate the importance of language and the language difference and the cultural differences. And of course, the language people don't appreciate the business background. And yet, we really do need both of those. And this then has an impact on our thought patterns. In low context Western cultures, what is important is logic and facts. Whereas we mentioned already in Japan, it's protocol, etiquette, and forms. There are other ways of doing it. India, very often they say we are morally superior. The Mexicans will argue, you owe us because you wronged us in the past. So there are all sorts of aspects that you can get that. But these are culturally loaded forms. When the West talks about logic and facts, we have certain things in mind. We talk about Aristotelian logic. And what that means is we look at the problem and we want to solve the problem. The goal is to solve the problem and come up with a solution at the end. So what we have is a sequential staging. It is analytical and it's linear. You look at the problem, you look at potential changes or solutions, and you say, what would happen if? Now, If you go into East Asia, that's a very different way of looking at it. There you have the yin-yang. It's holistic. It's links. You look at connections. You look at relationships. You look at the balance between the hot and the cold, the good and the bad. It is not an either-or thinking. For us, a contract is a contract, and now you have to live up to this contract. Whereas in Eastern thought patterns, well, the contract will depend on, and then you can put anything in. Circumstances change, and therefore our understanding changes. You can see in international dealings that can create problems, and there's arguments both in the Eastern world as well. If they want to play on the international stage, they have to live by the rules of international business, but that, of course, is to some extent negotiable. So it is not just that you can say, oh, we'll do this or we will do that, but in contract negotiations, you have to know, does this person come from a more holistic background, relationship background, or does this person come from a more Aristotelian background? I mentioned already the importance of time. That has an implication of our thought patterns as well. If we look at that, the inflexibility, for example, if somebody comes from a different viewpoint, we say, oh, well, you are inflexible, or, well, the either-or, it's unprincipled. We will say of the Eastern cultures, well, you just cannot make up your mind. It is wishy-washy. It is not very clear. So, as we look at that then, when we look at the role of time, there are two basic aspects. And in law, time is very important, because if you have a contract, it usually stipulates by what time the contract will have to be fulfilled, what the penalties are if you don't fulfill the contract by that time, etc. And that is usually written down in the contract. But this comes from a view of time that is monochronic, industrial, or linear. We live by the clock. We plan, we focus on the future, and we are interested in the results. We are masters of our destiny. And the contract, of course, is sort of the ultimate in that, because we say, well, you have signed the contract, and therefore you have to live up to the contract. And as we sit down and actually say, yeah, we've signed that, this is the contract now, but the understanding of the contract may be quite different. The other view of time is polychronic, agricultural, or cyclical. It's much more based on the seasons and the nature and relationships. Building relationships takes time. And therefore, you really look at it very differently. You cannot control time. Time happens. You cannot rush it. There is no vocabulary for time. In polychronic time, you cannot save time, make time. The whole concept of fast food, for example, would not make sense. Whereas in monochronic time, that becomes a major aspect. So as we look at that, we really need to look at what is the role of time in your particular environment. And you may find, as you negotiate with people from another culture, their understanding of time may be quite different. Now, towards the end here, what I would like to do is, I'm skipping some things here, I would like to look at some of the strategies for dealing more effectively with intercultural issues. The first thing you need to do is create a very solid self-awareness. When you look at the literature, very often they talk about you have to understand the other side. And that is true. You have to understand the other side. But the first step really is that you have to understand yourself. And then you can examine the role of culture in a particular context. So But the particular context, let me just give you an example here. Laws on copyright, on intellectual property. You probably deal a lot with that. Copyright is a huge issue in Western culture, and it's based on the concept of individualism. Now, the argument is, I created it, therefore I should profit from it, and if you want to use my intellectual property, you should pay. But this is very different when you in China, for example. Now, China has good laws on intellectual property, but it's not enforced very well. So they probably said, well, you want laws on intellectual property? We have the laws on intellectual property. So, but, then what we do with it is a very different aspect. But you have to understand culturally, at least you have to understand it where they come from. For example, the book that I have with my co-author, Intercultural Communication in the Global Workplace, was translated into Chinese, and it's also available in English in China. I was at a conference in Shanghai when this professor came up to me, very excited. She was so happy that she finally got to meet me. She gave me a copy of her book and said, without me, she could have never written her book. And, I was flattered. I thought this was wonderful. And then my co-author's husband is Chinese, and he said, well, have you looked at this book in more detail? I said, no. He said, well, you will find this very interesting. There were whole passages of our book that were taken verbatim without giving any source whatsoever. It was simply lifting whole passages. Now, from our viewpoint, she stole. From her viewpoint, she gave us face. Basically what she said was, non-verbally, you said it so perfectly, I couldn't possibly improve on that. Therefore, I just took it the way you have it. Now, that does not mean that we have to accept their view of copyright, but at least we do have to understand where it comes from. And views on copyright come out of a cultural understanding and cultural history. So what we do then, as we look at that, we want to map the differences. We have our self-awareness. We map our cultural differences and say, now, where are we similar? Where are we different? Why are we similar? Why are we different? And we want to bridge that gap, and now we communicate. Maybe we come to the conclusion that we really can't do much. Maybe we cannot do business together. It's too far apart. And then we have to assess the results. Now, what is very important in business and in the legal profession as well is that we negotiate the cultural context in terms of what we do. There's a lot on the influence of culture on negotiation, but let me face that in a somewhat different way. We negotiate the culture how we want to work. Now, this diagram in the outer circle gives you the things that you cannot change. You cannot change their legal system. You cannot change their history. You cannot change their business. You cannot change their court systems. That is a given, and you have to be aware what the givens are. You have something we have to be aware of. But then there are other things where we can negotiate, where you say, well, now let's look for things where we can negotiate a commonality. And then at the end here, there's, as I mentioned already, you are an individual, but you're also part of a gender, you're part of a professional culture in your terms. The legal culture, you're part of your law firm, you're part of the legal profession, and you're part of a national culture. So what we do then in this context is there is the critical awareness of the front and the backstage culture, the role of high context and low context, and the importance of overcoming our self-reference criterion. We can do that by negotiating, the culture under which we will work. This is a new paradigm. This is a new structure. We have to understand before we judge. Intercultural communication does not mean you are right, I'm wrong, or I'm right, you are wrong. That's not it. I have to understand. Then I may come to the conclusion, under the circumstances, your culture will not work for the following reasons, but I have to understand first. And then I obviously have to distinguish between minor and major cultural differences. All right, this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for being a part of this, and I will turn it over to Mr. Marletta.
Thanks, Iris. Thanks very much. It's very inspiring. And we knew since the beginning that 1 hour was too short for such a vast and interesting topic. But we aim today at raising awareness about the need to be prepared, the need to foster our communication skills. And unfortunately, we don't have time to take questions. I have replied to one question publicly, so every participant will receive a link to download the webinar and to download the presentation. You are going to receive a link to fill out a satisfaction survey. Would like to hear your feedback and about this webinar. And if you're interested in get in touch with Iris or you have further questions, don't hesitate to get in touch with myself or the AIJA office. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Iris. It was great to have you here today, and I wish everyone a good day and a nice evening, depending where you are. This is a reference criterion to be used, so your geographical presence. Thanks a lot, and I wish you all a good time. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye.